Hello, friendly neighborhood nerds. If you want to hear interviews from industry pros, get first looks, and have access to endless comic content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell!
What up, friendly neighborhood nerds? This is Judah Radd. I'm here with Robo Strange. Unfortunately, Ree is unable to make it today, but she sends her love. We have a very, very special guest. He's written for Valiant, Boom, DC, Vertigo, Avatar, Image, IDW, where he worked on an Eisner-nominated horror anthology series titled In the Dark, and more. He has the second best beard in comics. In 2012, he was nominated for a Harvey Award for Most Promising New Talent. Folks, it is my honor to introduce Justin Jordan. How you doing?
Welcome.
Good. Thanks for having me, guys.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for being here. It's very, very excited to have you. By the way, the first best beard in comics is Alan Moore. Obviously.
Well, obviously.
Yeah.
To be fair, I do not worship a fictional snake god, which adds like 10% to your beard. I'm told.
That's true.
If you're
beard gains.
Yeah.
10 plus damage points for beard damage points.
Yeah, it's
Cool.
funny listening to the roll call because as yet Oni has still escaped my grasp, but I have otherwise worked for every one of the bigs in comics. So
funny.
Marvel as well.
yeah, I've done Marvel. I did a short story for them years ago that was it was Captain America and Jubilee fighting Nazi vampires in a
Hell
sub.
yeah. Sounds
And-
dope.
That's 100% something.
Let me
I'd
write
like to
that
read.
down.
Yeah, that's in A versus X, one of the anthologies of that. And more recently, I did the last 4 issues of Monsters Unleashed, taking over for Cullen Bunn like 2-3 years ago.
Oh,
Maybe.
Okay,
I don't know.
cool.
What is time? This year's been
Right.
46 years long, so
That's
I
right.
don't know when
That's
it
right.
happened.
Yeah.
I don't even remember a time before 2020. I feel like I was born in 2020.
In the before
Uh,
time.
So I was first introduced to your work with Shadowman, which man, I like. You should have heard me when I was reading that. I couldn't shut up. I did not shut up about it. I was all about that run. But I have to say, I would have loved for you to remain on that title longer. Is there anywhere else you wanted to go with those characters? Because it felt like you had more plans specifically for Dark.
Yeah, I mean, so what ultimately happened with Shadowman is, well, there are 2 answers to that question, which are sort of interrelated. One of the things that went on with Shadowman when I was on it was that kind of everybody that was involved in the book had a different vision of what they wanted the book to be. And so what I would have preferred to have done would have been a much more kind of horror influenced take.
Yes.
And so when I was doing Shadowman, I was then kind of a newbie writer in the sense of like working with companies and that kind of stuff. I had written a lot of independent comics and all that kind of stuff, and I had been doing the actual writing part of it. But in terms of like working with companies and like properly calibrating my expectations, this was basically my first work for hire thing. So kind of simultaneously, Tim Seeley got me to do 2 issues of Hack Slash for him, which is my first honest-to-God work-for-hire work. And then almost simultaneously, Shadowman and Team 7 at DC happened. And so this is right at the beginning, and I had this plan that was like for like 25 issues, which is just fucking gibberish. I don't know if Shadowman has gotten to 25 issues total yet across the various incarnations. I think it probably has, but I know it's not hugely over that, right? But like I was like, yeah, we're gonna do 25 issues, and I got this kind of a plan, and we're gonna do this sort of thing. And so that would have been a much more horror oriented take. So there was stuff I wanted to do that would have been so like one of the things I had proposed for them in like the second arc was that we would have done basically vampires, but the vampire in question would have been more like a combination of like a Russian mobster and a tick.
Yes.
So he would like suck somebody's blood, and he would be this massive bloated thing, but he would still have that gaudy like Russian mobster kind of style because he's originally from like Eastern Europe kind of mob
Right.
and stuff. So it would be stuff like that with Dark as kind of this growing threat in the background, and then it would kind of culminate in Dark actually making it to Earth in in and around the last arc that we had planned. Now, obviously, that didn't and couldn't happen. Where we ultimately went with it is where where, what was the last issue I did of Shadowman? 11?
10 or 11, I think it was 11.
10 or 11? 10. So where we ended up there, at the end of the second arc, that was broadly where we would always have gone. They wanted to get Dark in the book more and sooner, which I understand because he's a popular character. And part of that also was my fault, and I would put air quotes around fault. I realize I'm just a faceless voice to you guys, but I say fault because part of what happened is I did that 0 issue, and the 0 issue remains, to me even, probably one of the best single issues I've ever done, right? And they were like, wow, you're really good at writing Dark. We got to have more of him sooner. So, I kind of brought that on myself, too. So that is sort of where I went with it. But, honestly, in the very beginning of Shadowman issue 1, if you had left me to do Shadowman, the design and feel of it would have been much more like what we saw with Josiah in the beginning of the first issue, the superhero kind of aspect of it. It would not have been like a straight horror thing, but it would have leaned much more into that. And I had kind of different designs than what I think ultimately sort of happened with it. So I'll spoil the crap out of Shadowman here. So anybody that has not read my take on Shadowman,
you should.
Yeah. So what we had originally kind of conceived, and they got away from this after my run, was that the Loa that is the Shadowman entity, essentially Sandria Dark had fallen in love with and ran away with an ancestor of Jack Boniface, the main character, and this is in the book, parts of it. What she did was she gave birth to twins, as she was a twin to Master Dark, and she basically sacrificed one of the twins to create this Loa that possessed the other twin, and that created the Shadowman line, and it was passed down. Which, what that was meant to do, and this is the part that actually didn't make it in the thing, and it actually kind of goes back to some of the earlier versions of Shadowman, at the other incarnations of that. What that was meant to do was that Jack's real power, his biggest weapon against Dark, because Shadowman was always intended to be primarily a weapon against Master Dark, is that he was immune to direct magic by Master Dark. So Master Dark could not just kill him. And so by the time Master Dark got back to Earth, he was kind of super powerful and really a corrupting influence. And so that would have been kind of the secret sort of ace in the hole. And we would have been developing that the whole time. And that kind of stuff. And we kind of ultimately didn't get to do it. I'm still actually very proud of my run on Shadowman. That was kind of a tremendous pain in the ass behind the scenes, especially through the second arc, where we kind of the story kept changing from issue to issue what the arc was about. Like when we started out with the Samiti stuff, in issue 6 or 5 or whatever the first issue of that was, we were not intending for that to be a Master Dark story by the end of it. So that it actually still hangs together fairly well is still kind of impressive to me, even though I wrote it. I'm I don't know how I actually pulled that off.
It worked. So nothing against Peter Milligan, but I feel like he didn't even read your run the way he continued it. Tonally, and even it's kind of ignores the whole Loa origin and the meaning of the Loa as it relates to Master Dark and I guess his sister. So I don't know. Did you guys even talk or what?
We did not. And so the stuff that Peter, I know him. I've never met Peter Milligan. The things that he did were stuff that Valiant would have liked me to do that I was fighting back on them hard about, and so it ultimately didn't make it into the book that we were doing. And I say that, which makes it sound like I have a bad relationship with Valiant, which I do not. I don't have as much of a relationship now since Dinesh and everybody left, but I continue to do small projects with them, and I am still, I still talk to them fairly regularly and that kind of stuff. It's just that Shadowman at that incarnation, it ended up being, kind of fraught with peril for everyone who did it. I think the only person who had a smooth experience was Jody when she was writing Shadowman 4000.
Yeah.
But I don't know if those were. I don't know if Milligan was executing ideas that they had, or if they were talking to Milligan while I was still doing it. And I don't mean that in a nefarious sense. Like, that book was hard enough to write and was eating up so much of my time that I was actually ready to quit after the first arc, but I continued on. So it was clear to everybody that I was not staying on that book for the long term, because just as a work thing, it wasn't going to fit. And I love the character and I like Valiant, but that was strictly at that point. Shadowman was responsible for, and these are not made up numbers, I actually did the math. It was 10% of my income, but it was taking up 40% of my working time, which I can't make that work. So I don't know how that spun out with Milligan. I do think, I really like Andy Diggle's run on it, and I feel like, though, and I might just be projecting, I felt like even with Andy's stuff that there was still kind of this friction between what everybody wanted the book to be. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I think that has been the Shadowman curse in this incarnation, is that,
too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, to an extent. And it's a shame, because I like the character. I also like, I've joked about it before. I have this tendency that I will put in these pitches for projects that the company really loves, and they give me the job, and then we do something else entirely. And that has happened to me literally at least half a dozen times. That was the story of every project I did at DC, except for New Guardians. New Guardians was actually what I pitched them on, but everything else kind of mutated in the process. So the original Shadowman pitch, which I will probably kind of dust off the things, with this idea that Shadowman existed as a sort of urban legend, as a literal urban legend. He was something that the kind of poor and dispossessed people in New Orleans, which is a lot of them, had kind of came up with this idea of this protector figure.
Very Spanish.
Yeah, and they believed in it so hard that when Jack, who was a different kind of character, died in a way that fit the legend, he became the legend. He was resurrected by their kind of collective belief. And what was interesting to me, I thought that was cool. It was basically, there's a now ancient article on, it's still available on the web, or it was last year. It's basically a story, it's a news article out of Miami, and it's about how these kind of runaway kids had sort of created this default religion around this blue lady. Neil Gaiman has talked about this too. He also found it to be pretty striking. And that was the basis on that, was that these people, the people kind of came up with this brand new, almost religion, and in the process had inadvertently created a new Loa that was Shadowman, was essentially where that was going. But one of the things I thought was interesting, and I'll pat myself on the back about this, get in love with your own ideas, was one of Shadowman's limitations, if that had been the thing we had done, would have been that he had to live to the legend. Which is to say, he was bound by what people's expectations were from him, and if the public, if he did stuff that was against it, even if it was the morally correct thing to do, he would lose power, and if people stopped believing in him, he would die. So the kind of the bad guys would actually sort of use that kind of stuff against him too. All of which I still think is a pretty cool idea, and I will probably come back to it someday, because it's not Shadowman specific. But yeah they're like, this is great. Let's do something different entirely.
That's interesting.
Headline. Justin Jordan announces Blue Lady project.
Exactly.
Cool. So I'm glad that you said that your relationship with Valiant is still good, because that doesn't ruin the next question I have for you, which is, by the way, we talked to Joshua Dysart last week, and he says hi, by the way, and we're huge fans of Valiant. So I think it's clear there aren't plans, but do you have a desire to work with Valiant again? Is that something we can see in the future?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I would not be against that. I do know I'm friendly with some of the editors that are still there and that kind of stuff. And I am totally for it. They have not approached me for it, so there's nothing in the plans. But if they have something that they, if they'd like me to create something new for them, or if there's an existing property that they would like me to take on, I'm totally, in theory for it. It would depend on the specifics of it,
Sure.
but I'm down for it.
Awesome.
Cool. So, kind of shifting gears. The first volume of Strange Talent of Luther Strode was awesome. Disgusting, insanely violent. But it was also unexpectedly very tragic. What inspired that?
So it is explicitly a tragedy. I talked to that with Trad from the beginning. And it's actually, I'm going to wander off into writery, literature kind of pretension here. It is actually also a tragedy in the classic sense, which is Luther is a heroic figure who is undone by his own fatal flaw, which in his case, his fatal flaw is fundamentally his youth. He just has a different view of what this journey he's going through is going to be versus what it actually is. Mm-hmm. And he keeps making what is ultimately the wrong decision for the right reasons, and that they just sort of stack up on him. Like, you can't say that he's not acting maliciously, but like you're like, no, man, that's not how the world works, dude. Just pull back, and it just keeps kind of biting him, that kind of stuff. So it's interesting. There's a couple of things that sort of went into Strode when I was sort of generating. And the obvious ones, and I've talked about them before, were the really direct one is we were drawing from two things. One of which is obviously the Charles Atlas style kind of bodybuilding courses. That is true. That is actually the third thing, which is the sort of meta level version of it. It is not as obvious to people. The ones that people tend to gravitate to is that we basically wanted to do a thing where a kid. I had this quasi insight one time that from a certain point of view, not necessarily in the Jedi sense, that some superheroes are not a world removed from the classic interpretation of movie slashers, right? So, like, if Jason Voorhees decides that you have transgressed, he is an unstoppable killing machine that will murder you for what you've done. That is also the Punisher, right? Like, and I think even though he doesn't typically kill people, it is not at all hard to conceive that as a version of Batman who is this terrifying, almost supernatural figure, relentlessly pursuing you. So I was just like, well, what if we made that overt? Like Strode is basically a kid who thinks he's becoming a superhero and is becoming a slasher. Is sort of where that first thing goes.
Yeah,
interesting.
But as it goes with the tragedy, it is the Spider-Man influence. It is looking at. I have said that Strode and Luther in particular is Peter Parker if he didn't have Uncle Ben.
Okay.
That is sort of that. And so I was looking at that, and I kept seeing sort of the tragic aspects of it. You know what I mean? Like that. If you are given this great power and you've had a hard life anyhow, and you're a teenager, when your judgment is poor, it's just not going to end well for you. At least not without a lot of heartache first, right? So that naturally kind of shifted into sort of a tragic sort of tale. And so I was overtly writing to kind of the rhythms of a classic tragedy.
That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of a thread I just read that talked about the nature of Batman himself, where it was like talking about how when you really look at what Bruce Wayne and Batman, that character has done, really all he is somebody who violates civil rights and acts extrajudiciously, but doesn't really do anything to fix anything, right? And so you talk about Luther Strode and his youthfulness. What I really liked about your book, by the way, are your letters in between. And so I'd read those, and I loved the word when you said how real evil is insidious, so I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. Like, if I go around and I'm stopping muggings, like, what am I really doing for the society around me,
Well, that is exactly true. It's funny, the reason I was chuckling a bit when you brought up that particular thread is that I have written about 18 Facebook posts about it in the last 2 days, because I fucking love Batman. And that thread, I'm going to tangent on that for a minute, and I realize I've been rambling at you with these long ass answers.
That's why you're here. We love it.
Yeah, if I'm going on too long or too much, just feel free to interrupt me.
Not at all.
I love Batman, but I think Batman as a character is absolutely kind of fraught with peril, especially depending on the lens that you're looking him through, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, one thing that I pointed out is I have heard this latest iteration of Batman is a super cop is not new to me, right? Like, my problem, and part of it is pedantic, because when I would wish, I have a thing where I wish people would fact check and get their stuff right. So in that particular example, and I realize this is not his main point, is that he's like, well, when you put Batman in a gritty reality and it doesn't have supercomputers and, you know, supervillains and like ninja skills, I'm like, you're clearly talking about the Nolan movies, and they literally have all those things. Like, that is that. And the other part of that is, to an extent, he is right in the movies. The movies do not have not classically made much of an emphasis, if any. The Nolan movies do a bit. Snyder and Burton and Shoemaker didn't at all, about the role of Bruce Wayne in Gotham, you know, in terms of working with that kind of stuff. That is typically a theme in the comics, at least during my lifetime. It has been. It's not usually an emphasis because, frankly, that's not what Batman comics do, right? Like, that's at a certain point, you're sort of like bending the character sort of thing, right? Like, so, like, it's like using James Bond. Like, James Bond is not a look into high-level international diplomacy. That is not what James Bond is built to do. And if you try to make James Bond do it, it's gonna suck.
That's right.
It becomes Jean Le Carré.
That's exactly it. And I love Jean Le Carré, but that's not what James Bond is, right? And so, to an extent, I agree with. There's this weird thing, right, where I'm like, at a certain level, if you are looking at stories about these characters, there is just a certain point of unreality, which it becomes kind of absurd to look at them this way. Like, if you want to say, so for instance, the example that I've used is, if you want to look at Batman and say, well, he's just a rich dude who is violating people's civil rights, you're not wrong. But at the same time, a lot of times people will not put that same kind of critical eye to, like, Spider-Man, right? If you want to look at Spider-Man and its depiction of the police, and I'm going to try not to get too political here, but it's kind of an inherently political sort of tangent, is the Spider-Man universe is, and I don't mean Marvel Universe in general, although this is kind of true, but I mean, when you look at specifically the totality of Spider-Man movies and Spider-Man comics, what they usually do, and with anything that big, you will always find exceptions. They're generally pretty pro-police in the sense of Spider-Man webs up things, he leaves them for police. The police might think Spider-Man is a criminal, but they're never presented as being corrupt.
Right.
And they're also never presented as part of a systemic problem, right? Like, that is one of the things that Batman does, is it will in the more recent depictions, especially Gotham PD, with the exception of Gordon and some, you know, others like Renee Montoya, are generally presented as being a corrupt police force with a good apples.
Like that Flash guy in Year One, right?
Exactly so.
Yeah.
But even that is looking aside from the fact that this goes back into that insidiousness thing. Is a lot of what goes on with police is above the police even. Like, you know, a lot of the things, and I'm going to stray vaguely political, is we ask the police to do a lot of things that police shouldn't be doing. And part of that is we have cut other programs. And part of that is that we have what I would say are a lot of bullshit laws. There's just stuff that, like, people should not be in jail for. Like, if you are smoking weed and you're not hurting anybody, like, there is no reason to have cops come into your door to get you for that. You know what I mean? Like, that's just that. All of that is beyond the scope of a Batman comic while still being a Batman comic. Like, that is just not what the character is designed to do. And if you look at it through that lens, yeah, like, he's going to fall short. And so is Spider-Man, because in the Spider-Man universe, the cops are always on your side. It's a universe where Peter Parker is an optimist, and if you're in trouble, you can go to a cop. That is not the experience of a lot of people, right?
That's right.
But, like, that doesn't mean that Spider-Man is bad individually for that. It's just, that's not what those stories are meant to do. That's a certain view of the world, and if you look at them through ideological lenses, that's valid, but that is also taking them way beyond what they were designed to do. That is not the point of a Spider-Man story or a Batman kind of story.
I agree. I do think, and I don't disagree with anything you said. I think that's all very well put. I also, and I can only speak for myself. I do not speak for I Freaking Love Comics, but all of that is a great argument for defund the police. So, like as far as, hey, re-vector them into what they should be, what they're designed for in the first place, and then rebuild a lot of the programs that you say are missing. I will say,
no argument for me, man.
Right.
I do. Can I? Sorry, I hate interrupting people,
Go for
but
it.
I'm going to lose my own thread. What I would like to say that is actually story and comic book related is, I also think that we have a tendency sometimes to look at micro instances of something when it's the meta macro view that's important.
Mm-hmm.
So, one thing that I've used classically is the Bechdel Test, which the Bechdel Test is, you guys are probably familiar, but for the reader, the simpler version of it is, are there two female characters who talk to each other about something other than a man?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're using that test to look at the sum totality of pop culture, it is useful. If you are looking at it for an individual work, it is not, right? So if you want to look at like cop shows, I think there is actually an important the way we view the police generally, especially honestly middle class white people, is really heavily influenced by pop culture. I don't think you can generally point to any one cop show and go, oh, they're the problem because X.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you can look at the sum totality of the presentation and say this thing. As it applies to Batman and superheroes, if you want to say superheroes are doing this fantasy thing that gives a simplified view of the world and maybe that's a bad thing, I'm actually there for that. I have caveats. I don't know that I agree. I think that's a discussion worth having. I think when you get it down to the level of like, this character is bad because they don't reflect these systemic things, I think that is an argument that needs a lot more rigor than like the Batman one has been presented with. You know what I mean? If you want to make it a kind of, intellectual sort of academic discussion, you know what I mean?
Right.
I think those as a meta level, looking at the role of how we view heroes in pop culture and, whether they're reactionary and that kind of stuff is worth doing. I think taking it down to the level of specific characters is probably pointless, in the same sense that there is lots of deeply misogynistic lesbian porn that will pass the Bechdel test. So that merely passing the test doesn't tell you anything about an individual work.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And
Yes.
there's lots of very finely crafted, culturally relevant stuff that would not pass the Bechdel test just because
It's just a baseline.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, definitely not a hard line in concrete, but to go back to what you were saying though about the relevancy of the critique of the critique. No, that's all right. It's on the same topic. But what I wanted to say was, as you're talking again, nothing that you said I disagree with. The only thing that I think I would add to that is that I do believe that there is usefulness behind having these kind of conversations with, hey, what are we really looking at when we look at a character like the Punisher? What are we really looking at when we look at a character like Batman? And I would say I would probably give a dismissive eye roll to anybody who says, and that's why you shouldn't read them. I'm like, okay, calm down. But I also think that to correct the Batman stories aren't for that, but I think it's a good vehicle to have the kind of conversations that need to be had, right?
It's still a fun and enlightening thought experiment.
Well,
having.
even more than just fun and enlightening. I think when we're having the discussion, I think it's cool. I'm a guy who I think like I love analogies, and sometimes when I'm having a discussion with somebody, I always go off on my stories with like, for example, and then people are like, you don't have to do it for example, just explain. I'm like, well, that's the way my brain works. So I'm like, so when I look at comic books, sometimes those are great stories to kind of illustrate a point. Like maybe you're right. So there's nothing wrong with Batman and the way that he's built and what the stories are for and all that. But I think it's a good vehicle to say, hey, if you look at this story, however, the character, a billionaire Bruce Wayne, here's what is missing. And it's not a critique on the story or the comic book or any sort of argument to say you shouldn't be reading it or enjoying it, but it is a good vehicle to go, you see what's missing in this story? And that's what we're missing in real life. Billionaires who aren't really doing what they should be doing with an insane amount of money.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
And it's funny because the other part of what I have said in those Facebook posts is that I actually think that the Officer Joe Chill idea that he comes up with is a good idea because of that.
Yes.
And I actually think it would be interesting. I've talked about it in the past. I think it would be interesting. The problem is I don't offhand know how you would fold it into a comic book, right? But it would be interesting to me to have Bruce Wayne trying to make structural changes to Gotham and finding out that even as a billionaire, it is hard to do, right?
Sure.
Like that.
Right.
It is just, that is stuff that is really, it's just difficult long-term sort of work.
White Knight sort of addresses that. I don't know if you read that, but basically the Joker through some kind of weird, he's good now, and he starts fixing Gotham for the better. But he's not going out and beating the shit out of people. He's like building schools and libraries and all these other like things, and it actually does make Gotham better. And Batman is like very upset about that.
If I were in the never gonna happen, given creative control of Batman, probably my version of it would be something like Bruce Wayne's way of saving Gotham City is using the wealth to make really good structural changes. Batman exists because on some level, Bruce Wayne is also still locked into being an 8-year-old child who's scared and enraged, right? So he to an extent needs to kick ass to make himself feel whole. Right. But he is intelligent enough to realize that it's not actually helping. I think there is, and this goes back to your point earlier, is that I think by asking those questions, you can find interesting story aspects to kind of plumb. And I think the idea that Batman is, and this is true of Punisher too, they're sort of this cathartic revenge tale it's what their core is. I don't think you should shy away from that. Yeah, like you, the thing that gets me is when you add the codicil and you're wrong for liking these stories because of this. Right. Or, and you shouldn't read it because, or even when that's implicit, I don't think that's true. I think, I think you can ask those questions, and I think they should be examined. I don't think it necessarily makes the work bad. Then again, I fucking love Batman, so I'm biased. So I am also not sure that I am not doing some motivated reasoning. You know what I mean? Right.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love these talks. We should have these more. But I do. So moving on. That's my perfect transition right there. Moving on. I'm looking at the book and I see Tradmore's name on there, and I'm sorry, no offense to you, but it just made me even more excited. I was like, Tradmore, oh, it's fucking awesome. He drew an awesome, beautiful Silver Surfer book with Donny Cates last year. What was it like working with a super gory and violent Luther Strode? Working with Tradmore on such a book like that?
Oh, it was terrific. It worked out really well. For one thing, Trad and I are good friends now.
Awesome.
So it would have actually been worth doing just for that. But it turns out that Trad and Felipe and I, we have what we call the hive mind because we think about story really very similarly. So we're all pretty much, we can usually count on us all thinking the same thing anytime we do anything.
Nice.
So yeah, it's funny for me now, especially. So you live your life as it happens, which I say that faux philosophical bullshit because there are people now who are coming in to seeing Trad now, right? But I was with Trad when that's his first pro work is Luther Strode, right? So I've been there the whole time. So it's funny to me that people are like, oh, Trad is awesome, and I picked up this book because of Trad, which, it was always the case, but it wasn't the case that people were going back. Right. So it's weird to me experiencing it in that sort of reverse sort of fashion.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You peasants like Trad more. I liked him before he was cool.
It is kind of funny though. It's funny with Donnie that basically Trad has known Donnie and me for like years now. It's like 10, 12 years ago. And actually, Donnie was trying to get Tradd to do stuff when I snared him for like Luther Strode.
Yeah.
Nice.
So he finally got him for Silver Surfer Black, which worked out. Yeah, Tradd and Felipe really, really elevated that, as did Phonographics, who did lettering and stuff for us. And Phonographics is also does the letters for like Saga and that kind of stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been good, and especially as the Luther Strode series went on, as we went through the other two books, like that process became more and more collaborative. So, Legacy of Luther Strode in particular, like Tradd and I just beat out the plot when we were staying at conventions and stuff in hotel rooms and that kind of stuff. So those are legitimately co-written, and they are much better for having Tradd on than they would think. That was one of those things where the extent to which I got lucky in getting Tradd to get on the book cannot be overstated. Like it was one of those things work out. I occasionally get into people where they talk about some people get like they get unhappy when you talk about the role of luck, right? There's like, I worked really hard. And like, yeah, I worked really hard, but like frankly, like the fact that like I happened to find, I was looking at 100 Bullets fan art and I saw Tradd stuff and I followed it back to his DeviantArt. And I happened to send him an email when he was in between his junior and senior year at things, and and he agreed to do it. And then I sent it to Image, and I happened to send it in when Image was doing what they were doing. Like that's all shit that nobody can control. That's just luck. So yeah, I got really lucky, and it's been an extremely fruitful friendship and partnership, which continues. We haven't worked on anything in a few years, but I emailed Tradd Tradd emailed me just today, as a matter of fact. So we still text and talk. We have an ongoing email thread of me, him, and Philippe where we just show cool stuff to each other and what we're working on.
That's
awesome.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, it definitely gelled here. So if you guys ever work on anything in the future, I will buy it. I promise.
We
You have
want
one.
to. It's just a matter of finding the right stuff. Although I think these days Tradd is actually trying to move more into like writing his own stuff, which he should, because Tradd is also a very good writer.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it works out. But we'd love to work together. We want to get the band back together at some point. We just have not made our schedules in the right project for it yet.
Awesome. So you seem to have a gift for writing extraordinarily evil characters with Dark and the Librarian. Is that something like you enjoy doing? Is like, okay, this is gonna be the focal point here.
Oh sure. It's fun. Sounds bad, but it's true. It's fun and cathartic to kind of plumb the depths of human depravity.
Oh yeah.
There are places where I don't feel comfortable going, you know what I mean? You'll note that for the most part my villains don't get into like sexual violence and that kind of stuff, like just because I'm like, all right, there's places beyond which like even I'm not willing to push. But man, sometimes just thinking like, what is the shittiest, most evil shit I could do in this situation is sort of it's fun to get that all out in fiction, you know what I mean, rather than having it rattle around in your head. It is
absolutely.
funny though. I was thinking the other day about how I know a few horror writers and I know a few comedy writers, and almost to a person, all of the horror writers, and this includes me, are cheerful, warm, hey, do you want to see pictures of my cat people? And all the comedy people are these angsty, brooding, like, messes. I think you end up gravitating to, like, whatever is the opposite of your actual personality.
Stuff you need to balance yourself out. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
That's
Cool,
interesting.
cool.
So, we're going to talk a lot about Green Lantern, which you had to know this was coming. You had a very long run on Green Lantern New Guardians. Was it 22 issues, something like that?
Yeah, in an annual. So.
Oh yeah, and right, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, and I also wrote the Godhead special with Van. So a good bit of Green Lantern stuff.
Nice.
Actually, I have done more Green Lantern than anything else in my career except for Spread. Spread is still currently the thing I worked on the most at 25 issues. So.
I like the way you wrote Kyle Rayner. We were very fortunate. We had Ron Mars on our show a couple weeks ago, and he described Kyle as sort of like almost like the DC version of Spider-Man in the sense that he's like just a regular guy in extraordinary circumstances. What was your approach to that run?
I mean, in regards to Kyle in particular, I was actually trying to draw from the Mars run, and it was very specifically kind of taking a Spider-Man approach, but putting him in these kind of cosmic circumstances. I was trying to write him as a fairly grounded character, just thrust into the most bizarre cosmic sort of stuff there.
Yeah.
The thing with New Guardians that I wanted to do, I've always described it as the Star Trek sort of approach, because we were basically spending our time going to different planets and sort of exploring different kind of sci-fi concepts that I thought were interesting, and I thought that worked well for those characters and for that sort of thing, as well as sort of building sort of a meta arc. But one of the things I wanted to do when I was doing that is I wanted to sort of add to DC's bench in terms of their space characters and that sort of stuff. So I was wanting to create new planets and wanting to create new characters like Exeter and that kind of thing, and the God Killers. None of which have really been used since then, unfortunately, which is a shame, because I think the God Killers in particularly are a cool concept, and
very cool.
Very in particular, a really cool design, courtesy of Brad Walker and Will Quintana. They are super cool looking. So I'm a little disappointed that nobody else has picked up that torch. Not entirely surprised. But that was what I was trying to do with them. And it's also when you've got a character with the amount of kind of power and stuff that Kyle had, especially at that period, because he was the White Lantern and was coming to grips with that. That is also an interesting lens for me to kind of examine kind of what makes him tick and how these powers can be used and that sort of stuff. So it was fun. I really thoroughly enjoyed New Guardians, and actually of my work for hire stuff, that is probably the most pure thing that I've done, in the sense of that is basically almost exactly the story I set out to tell as I set out to tell it when I started the book, which you don't get an opportunity to do very often with work for hire.
Yeah, it's I like that run. Had you worked with those artists before, or was that your first time?
Nope, that was all new. Brad and I are still friends. We still chat. He's on Detective Comics now. And actually, it's funny because before I got on New Guardians, I was friends with Aaron Cooter and am still friends with Aaron, and he got moved off the book, so that didn't help me. But it would have been nice to work with Aaron too. But I really liked working with Brad. Yeah. No, right that was all kind of new stuff, and again, that is one of those things that's sort of a luck, because with Brad and the other artists that I work with, we actually all gelled together really well. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes you get artists where it is you guys just don't. Not even that you work together badly, but like there's the base level of like it works, and then there's this you're both creating something that is probably better than either of you could do individually, right? Which I think is where we got with like Brad and Will on that kind of stuff in particular.
Cool. So let's talk about Reaver. You just released issue 11, and it's a very metal title in my opinion. It's very metal, and I love the covers that Becky Cloonan's been drawing for this title, and then. I guess you changed from Alex Guimaraes, am I pronouncing that correctly? And Rebecca Isaacs to Nico Henrikon. What does this title mean to you? It's pretty cool. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so Reaver is basically a chance for me to tell grimdark fantasy stories in a comic book format. And I say grimdark fantasy, which is a legitimate genre. That is not just the thing I made up. So Reaver kind of comes about from I do like fantasy stuff, but my tastes in fantasy, probably unsurprisingly to anyone, tend towards the darker, kind of grittier sort of stuff. I don't want to say more realistic. I think there's an argument to be made that they are maybe emotionally more realistic, but like, for the most part, we're looking at stuff like the one that most people will be familiar with is the approach that George R.R. Martin takes in Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire to, Westeros and that sort of world. But there's also people like Joe Abercrombie does a series called The First Law. well, it's not really called anything, but the first trilogy is the First Law Trilogy. He's written like probably 8 or 9 books, actually one of which is due out in a week or two. In that world, which is just this very sort of like cynical take on high fantasy sort of stuff. It is to a certain extent the anti-Tolkien kind of stuff, and that has been where my taste gravitated towards. And I was looking at that, and I was like, I'd like to do that, but what was interesting to me, and what I've kind of intentionally tried to do with Reaver, is that I'm also trying to look at fuse dark fantasy with other sort of genres, right? So like the first arc of Reaver is called Hell's Half Dozen, and it is every bit the Dirty Dozen in Westeros is the easiest way to describe it. It is me taking a dark fantasy world and doing a military Suicide Squad adventure story.
Nice.
Yeah,
I love that idea.
By design. That was always the pitch. The Grim After, which is the second arc that just completed, is actually a noir story in a fantasy world. So I'm trying to take and build a story out of that kind of thing with those sort of things. The other part of Reaver that I like is that, and I think, if you ask me what one of the things about Grimdark that kind of makes it, I think there is, I touched upon it with the idea of emotional realism, but it's realism in the sense of what the consequences would be, right? So like I was looking at, okay, in this world, the implicit rules, they're explicit in the behind the scenes documents, but I don't think we've ever said it in the series, is that magic will always take more than it gives. But you can have somebody else pay the price, right? So what are the consequences of that? And then I started thinking about like, well, what if the Nazis got that, right? Like, what they would do with it. And then you look at like what nation states are like, right? And they're like, well, and again, without straying into the political too much, we look at like, look at the U.S. and we have a really high standard of living, and at least in part that's because other people have a really shitty standard of living, right?
Right. Somebody's always paying the price.
That's exactly it. And so magic is basically an extended metaphor for that in this world. And so I started looking at the ways to do that. And so that's kind of the in as much as Reaver has an overarching sort of story, it is basically that. It is somebody has realized that magic, and I'm not going to spoil the pretty good twist in the first one, but someone has realized that magic is becoming industrialized, and that's this world's equivalent of discovering nuclear energy, essentially. And they're like, oh, we really need to kill everybody who knows how to do this before it gets out of hand, because these asshole countries are definitely going to fuck up the world with it. You know what I mean? So
that's pretty awesome. How much longer do you think that run's gonna go?
That is a question that is always, it depends on sales. We started off really strong, and then COVID happened. So right now, I don't actually know if there's going to be a third arc. We would like to do one. It is up in the air. Several issues of it are written. We were intending to do it. So what might be feasible, depending, is switching over to do it as original graphic novels. And all of that is just me talking. None of this is to be interpreted as Skybound making anything. Yeah. I would actually like to make the switch to doing it as graphic novels, if we can make that kind of feasible. There's a lot of economic reasons that graphic novels, as just straight to graphic novels, are a hard thing to do in comics, because you're potentially losing out on a lot of sales. But I've done a couple of graphic novels now, and I also do urban animal webtoons, which is oddly the opposite of a graphic novel, but kind of hits the same thing, where I've realized that when I am not writing to the rhythms of a 20 or 24 page single comic, I like my writing better. I am able to let some scenes go more, and I'm able, even my action scenes improve a little bit, because when I write for, and I have no idea if this is interesting to you guys, but
it is.
When I write for single issues, I am basically trying to make every issue, it's not complete, right? We're unless it is, right? Unless it's done.
You have to deliver some kind of emotional payoff every 24 pages, though.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm trying to deliver what I call a complete chunk of entertainment, in the sense of, when you read it, you should feel satisfied that you've read something that was worth your $4. You know what I mean? But that by its nature, because you're limited to 24 pages, changes the way you play out those beats and stuff. So in Urban Animal, which I do for webtoons, the expectations are different, right? So each of those chapters is roughly the equivalent of 6 or 8 comic book pages, but because the expectations are different, I can let conversations about how characters are feeling about shit play out in a way that I can't bring myself to do in most 20-page issues and that kind of same stuff. It's the same deal with like action scenes and stuff. You are fundamentally sort of hemmed in by how much real estate you can devote to it. For some stuff like Strode and Reaver, I build it so that the climax can be an entire issue that's essentially a fight scene, because that's kind of what the books are. But, for the other stuff, you're sort of truncating stuff, not so much based on... It's not necessarily the best absolute way to tell a story. It's the best way to tell a story in the space you have available, right? And when I work outside of that, I'm finding that I think I'm doing better work. So I'm trying to transition to doing more graphic novels and that kind of stuff. But it is for economic reasons. It's just hard to make work.
I bet.
Understandable. Yeah, I get that. Like the industry is just constantly evolving, and it's kind of hard to keep up sometimes. So let's step away from work for a second. It's the 2020. I think we've all stayed home more this year than any other year of our lives. What kind of things have you been nerding out on lately? And it doesn't have to be comic related. Just TV shows, video games, movies.
Oh, so recently it's been movies. Movies aren't a thing anymore. Don't even taunt me with the movies. So my most recent things are, right now, I really fucking love Lovecraft Country.
Yes.
Yes. And Lovecraft Country, I'm not going to go into spoilers, overt spoilers, but I was shocked and pleased to find that they're basically taking the Good Place approach, which is they're burning through what would otherwise be a season's worth of plot in about an episode.
Yeah.
They're like, no, we're done with this. I'm like, oh, I thought that was going to be the whole season. Wow, I have no idea what's coming next. So I haven't read the book. I like Matt Ruff, the author who wrote Lovecraft Country, but for one reason or another, I didn't get around to reading Lovecraft Country. And then when the show was coming, I was like, well, I'm just not going to read it until after that. So I dig that. I've also most recently have gone and watched, just binge straight through both Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra.
Yes.
Avatar,
same.
I had seen most of. Legend of Korra, I had not, and I thoroughly enjoyed them both.
Same.
And they are, if anything, underrated.
Agreed.
The level of character work that the Avatar guys, and this is true of Dragon Prince as well, actually, just the level of character development and intricacy that they thread in there is really impressive to me. I am not that good of a writer in those things, and so I'm jealous of it. And I'm also actually impressed by the risks they are willing to take. Like I like Korra, the character, but like, man, they make her a dick sometimes.
Right.
Like, and you really risk losing your audience when you do that kind of stuff. So
and not wise. That's the best word I can have for it. Not very wise. Not very Avatar like.
No. But as somebody considering that's sort of one of the themes in Strode too, that's that's something that it resonates with me. That kind of stuff.
But Strode doesn't have the lifetime of avatars in his spirit.
It does not.
Right.
He has an excuse.
I also like one thing. I am kind of a world building nerd. I always caution people. I say that world building is masturbation, which is it feels like you're doing something when it's just often there for your own pleasure.
Fair. Yeah.
But world building can be really useful as long as you actually write the comic or whatever that you're world building for. If you're just making up worlds, like, that's not doing the work. And it's real easy to convince yourself you're doing the work when you're
That's
not.
Right.
So one thing I appreciate about Korra is, and this is true of Avatar too, but in Korra they're building on what was in Avatar, but just the intricacy of the world building and like what they do with bender powers, and they look at like, well, what's a world where people can do this?
Right.
Okay, what would they do with it? Like
policing.
Exactly. All that stuff ends up being really clever. So I really appreciated those. So those are the stuff I've watched most recently, it's funny, I have this problem where a lot of the time, because I spend my time working and thinking about stories, then by the time I get to the nighttime, which is the only time I will watch stuff, I have just burned out that there's stuff I desperately want to watch that's just too much mental work. So, like, I am way the hell behind on Better Call Saul, which I like.
Oh, man.
But I'm like, I don't have the bandwidth to deal with it,
Yeah.
especially during COVID time.
But I'm telling you, man, it's awesome. So awesome.
Yeah.
This
The quality of Saul is sort of ridiculous, like to the point where I was flicking through the channels a couple of weeks ago. It was, well, I say weeks. Time has no meaning. So whenever the most recent season of Saul was on, I came across AMC and Saul was on. And like 10 seconds, and I'm already like fascinated and like fully committed to whatever's going on in the scene in a show I have not watched in like 3 seasons. Because it was like Mike and Saul doing a thing. I'm like, oh, Jesus Christ, this is so good.
You know how Breaking Bad just starts in one place, and then if you skip 2 seasons, you're like, what the hell show am I watching?
Right.
It's like a whole different level.
Yeah.
Saul does that. Saul does that as well.
I will tell you guys, if you like Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, you guys need to watch Ray Donovan. Ray Donovan is super dope. It's in that same kind of like gritty drama.
Check it out.
Yeah, same dude. I can't remember his name right now. Same dude who played Sabretooth. It's pretty awesome.
Oh, Schreiber. Yeah.
Yep, there you go.
Schreiber.
Yeah.
I like those kind of crime things.
Yeah.
Probably my favorite show of all time is Justified. If it's not my favorite, it's right up there. I'm a big Elmore Leonard fan to begin with, so like nailing Elmore Leonard and Justified. And I'm also the other part that's like sort of like what I pointed out to people is that I am from the Appalachian part of Pennsylvania, so the culture is not really notably different than Kentucky in a lot of ways. Like, there's this stretch from Kentucky through West Virginia into central PA where it is literally Appalachian Mountains, but it's also Appalachian culture, right? Like, so I recognize the people in fucking Justified. I'm like, oh yeah, like they are getting some of this stuff right. Like, so I like that. So, like Ozark and Justified, and then Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul and that kind of stuff are like 1,000% like my jam. I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's
nice.
pretty awesome.
It's nice to see stories. It's nice to see stories that don't take place in New York or LA. There's a whole other country.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's funny whenever I'm writing stuff. A lot of my stuff ends up. You'll note that like at no point does it ever tell you where Luther Strode is, like city-wise.
Yeah.
Because if I'm writing stuff in an urban environment, in my head it takes place in what I just think of as the city, which is this weird fusion of New York and Baltimore, basically, because those are the places I spend most time, city-wise.
Right.
That's awesome. All right, Justin. You're on a deserted island. You can take your favorite movie and your 5 favorite trades with you. What is it?
Oh, that is tough.
There's also a TV to watch the movie on, by the way.
That's
like, all
good.
the other things.
Yeah.
All the other things you need are there.
Which one has the best DVD case? Because that's all I'm getting on this.
And the power to watch them. This is the best desert island you ever be.
All the other logistics are handled.
Yep.
Probably Pulp Fiction.
Oof. Yes.
Nice.
And while Pulp Fiction is one of my favorite movies, the reason it gets the specific desert island stuff is there is enough going on in that movie to like rewatch it a lot.
Yes.
Like the other movies that I love would be like John Carpenter's original Halloween or The Thing. I don't think have quite that same level of like, well, I'm going to be watching this 24 hours a day, so I need something with some meat on it.
That's right.
Trades.
What's Fonzie like?
Trades is probably Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, really showing my influences here. Probably the Planetary Omnibus.
Okay.
I'm trying to think, what else do I like? I always have trouble with these because I tend to be a kind of existing in an eternal present sort of dude. So, like, if I haven't read it recently, it's probably not gonna spring easily to mind.
That's pretty much how I am. And anytime somebody asks me that, it really is just whatever is the last thing I read that I really enjoyed.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Monstrous, I think
Ooh.
probably hits the list. And I would say probably Scott Pilgrim, actually, if I could get a complete, omnibus edition of that.
Nice.
Good choices. Good choices.
Good choices.
You might be judged for not having Saga in there, but that's okay. It's all right.
So
That sounds good.
honestly, I'm not a big Saga guy. Saga is one of those things where it's not that I think it is badly done, and I get why people like it, but what it is doing is not for me. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, this is just not my deal. Like, and this actually goes back into the world building thing. The one thing that keeps putting me off about Saga, no offense to Brian K. Vaughn, who is a terrific writer, and I deeply love Paper Girls, right? Like, is that Saga in particular doesn't feel like a real world to me. Like, it just feels like, oh, here's this cool shit with no effort to make it all work as an integrated sort of thing. Like, it feels like kids playing with dolls. And it gives me this distance from it that, like, is to its disadvantage. And it is objectively great sometimes. Like, the bit where Slave Girl is, like, talking about why she feels guilty about, the abuse, and Lion Cat's, like, lying is, like...
I love that.
Objectively terrific.
So that kind of leads me to one more question that we didn't have planned. And I think about this stuff whenever, like, Neil deGrasse Tyson is talking about how he can't watch sci-fi. So we both, we can write some stuff for a hobby, or if we want to try to get something done, but neither one of us are, like, educated in writing, like have a degree or know what it means to be a good writer. Do you find that being a writer makes it hard to enjoy things that other people would otherwise enjoy because of certain intricacies of writing that you can see?
No, I don't think it does. It can for people. It doesn't for me. So one of my favorite movies is fucking Roadhouse, man. So, like, my ability to, like, just turn my brain off and roll with it is pretty good. I am pretty good, I think, about judging movies based on what they are trying to do, not what I think they should be. And I think that is helpful, and that's helpful with stories.
That is a good way to look at it. Although, if you've ever been on the internet lately, you would know that the proper way to criticize things is just to say that they suck.
That's true.
Well, no. You don't attack the thing. You attack the creators. And you say they suck.
The creators,
yeah,
and the people who like it.
It's the Futurama. This is bad, and you should feel bad.
That's
like,
right. That's right.
It's one of those things where I have the advantage, and it's not like it's a conscious choice. Like, if I don't like something, I almost always just forget about it. Like, it just doesn't really register on me. Every now and again, something will be... Mostly it's when something is good. I feel the urge to dissect it and figure out why it worked. Every now and again, I will get something that is bad that I do the same sort of thing for, but it is not usually in the moment. Generally, very occasionally, it will be a thing where something is not engaging me to the point where I can't help but have my writer brain sort of kick in. But, like, there's stuff that I enjoy that is, if I look at it through a critical writer lens, is clearly ropey as fuck. Like, I liked Return of Skywalker, or whatever the last Star Wars movie's subtitle was. Sorry, it's been a long day, so my brain is not what it once was.
Sounds good.
You just summoned the rage of 7 billion angry Star Wars Twitterers.
Return of what?
Sure.
What? And you like it?
And the thing is, I liked that movie, but I will also acknowledge as a writer that it is deeply fucking ropey. Like, and it is not how I would have done it. But in the moment, and see, this is, I'll tangent on a bit. One thing that J.J. Abrams, and I do not mean this as a backhanded compliment, one thing that he is legitimately good at is what I call the moment, and that's capital T, capital M. He is good at building these emotional moments out of almost nothing. And in the moment, as you're watching, it feels great, and it doesn't hold together at all when you get any distance from it. You know what I mean? But that's, to an extent, obviously, I like it when things really hold up and all that sort of thing. But, like, particularly with, like, Star Wars movies, like, I am looking for the moment, right? That is what I go to Star Wars for. It is better if it holds up, but if it hits at least that basic level, I am satisfied. You know what I mean? And like, to even more unleash the hordes. I don't, for the most part, don't think The Last Jedi gets there for about 2/3 of the movie, and that's my issue with it. It's funny you bring up the thing though. One thing that is frustrating is the people that are basically just misogynist assholes about Last Jedi have made it impossible to criticize all the other stuff that's wrong with it.
Yes.
Man, preaching to the choir. Like, I'm hesitant to criticize it because I don't want to be associated with them.
Yeah, same. But it's Last Jedi is at the risk of ruining your podcast is frustrating because basically anytime that movie is focused on Force users, it's awesome and I'm fully engaged. And anytime it goes to Holdo, actually not Holdo, I like Holdo, but anytime it goes to Isaac Oscar's character Poe Dameron or Rose and Finn, it doesn't work, and it doesn't work in ways that have nothing to do with like diversity or cultural content and that kind of stuff.
Of course.
And it doesn't work in ways that are frustrating coming from Rian Johnson, who makes fucking terrific movies. Knives Out was probably my favorite movie last year, right? Like it's awesome, but like, man, Last Jedi is just not his wheelhouse.
I think with the most recent Star Wars trilogy, I mean, the amount of talent involved is through the roof. Like you said, Rian Johnson, J.J. Abrams, the cast, every single person who put even a finger on those movies is a master of their craft. I think what those movies suffered from was too much feedback and too much input to the point where it almost feels like 50 different, completely unrelated visions trying to create one thing together. I think that's where it fails.
I agree. It's also one of those things where they either didn't have a plan or they changed the plan as they went. And it's actually fine to not have a plan if you are good at camouflaging the fact that you didn't have a plan. Those movies do not do it well. Like, and that's one of the things like you can't criticize about Last Jedi. But the thing is like take like the what's the bad guy that's voiced by Andy Serkis? Snoke. Snoke is clearly set up as a mystery in The Force Awakens. So when you just casually like destroy him and don't answer that at all, I like the fact that they just killed him, but the fact that there is no context for who he is, that is not a good storytelling choice. It just isn't, and it isn't because of the way it's set up. Whereas the Rey's parentage reveals actually is a solid storytelling choice in that movie because it's subverting that sort of thing. But like, you've got to play by sort of the groundwork you set up. But like, one of the things that frustrates me about Last Jedi is that it is so very willfully not following up on things that have been set up, and it does it in a way that's inorganic and inelegant. Yeah. Well,
almost boldly, like, ha, fuck you guys.
Well, that's exactly it. In a way that doesn't necessarily make sense. Like, for instance, like, why the hell is Luke wearing his formal robes when Rey gets there? Just to change into his dark clothes. Like, the only reason that happens is because you're intentionally pivoting away from what the previous movie did. And that can be fine. But I don't think Last Jedi does it well. And that's, it's not the only problem that movie has, but like, it's there. Like, if you're going to do that stuff, like, you need to make it kind of work. It's like Thor Ragnarok could not be more different from Thor Dark World. But it's so the thing that I've used in the past to talk about this is what Last Jedi does. It's bad improv, right? In the sense of good improv is going yes and, where you take it stuff. And to J.J. Abrams' credit, he is not retconning Last Jedi. He's just going yes and adding stuff to it that changes it. Last Jedi is very, very intentionally in a lot of places. Sometimes not going no and. Yes. And that's the same thing with like Thor Ragnarok. The reason you can get away with doing something as goofy as Thor Ragnarok is it doesn't negate anything that happened before. It just yes ands and rolls with it. And Taika Waititi is funny as fuck, so that helps. But like,
It sounds like we could talk about movies all day because
Yeah,
I
sorry,
think
I'm
no. That was not a criticism. That was more of like a man. I wish that we were all just sitting around hanging out. But we're gonna go ahead and we have one more question, and it's kind of the question we ask everybody. Do you have any cool new projects coming down the pipeline that you can talk about, or maybe even something super secret that you want to reveal right here and right now on the show?
There are two answers to that. The one thing that I can't talk about is the thing I've got coming out next that's new is Summoner's War Legacy, which is a comic adapting a mobile game property, which does not sound like it would be cool, but is actually awesome. And it's actually ended up being a really fun book. It's funny, it goes back to Avatar: The Last Airbender because Avatar is actually kind of the tone that I'm trying to channel there. So it's been fun to try to work in that sort of thing. It's very different in that regard than what I would do in Reaver. You know what I mean? They're kind of two ends of the fantasy spectrum. I am also working on this awesome project that is the most it's intentionally me loving 90s movies and Hong Kong heroic bloodshed and
Yes.
a certain kind of 90s anime or late 80s anime like Golgo 13 and Ghost in the Shell and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
With a very cool artist. I'm actually working on issue 6 of that this week, and the artist is drawing the first issue. So hopefully we'll be announcing that sooner rather than later. But it is super fucking cool.
Yes.
I am unreasonably pleased with it. So I hope people dig it too.
Awesome.
Can't wait. And by the way, my next band is going to be called Heroic Bloodshed. I think that's a good name.
Nice.
Nobody steal that from me. Cool.
Trademark. Ladies and gentlemen, Justin Jordan, thank you so much for coming on the show and giving us your time. We hope you come on again. Yeah, for sure. You guys take it easy. We'll put links to all the books that he's brought up and where you can get them. Make sure you try to go to your local comic book store first, but we will put links in the description if any of these books that we talked about interest you. You guys have a good one. Wear your mask.
Be free, follow our links, and watch our show because you want to and not because of the threats. Thank you for watching Judah, Robo, and Ree. We talk about comics, movies, and TV. Sometimes we have notable guests, and sometimes it's just us. But we're also cool.